In 1914, the village of Malatya, tucked away in the eastern reaches of the ailing Ottoman Empire, felt like a small, self-contained world. The Armenian families there had been part of the landscape for centuries. Their days were measured by the scent of baking bread and the tolling bell of Saint Garabed Church. The village patriarch, Krikor, was a man of simple faith, the anchor for his daughter, Vartouhi, and his grandchildren. The war that erupted across Europe that summer felt distant. They were loyal Ottoman citizens. They had lived side by side with their Turkish neighbors for generations. Krikor often said that while their faiths were different, their hearts were tied to the same soil. Then came April 24th, 1915. The change wasn't gradual. It was immediate and terrifying. In distant Constantinople, hundreds of Armenian leaders and intellectuals, the thinkers, poets, and politicians, were arrested. Within days, they were gone. Vartouhi felt the shadow of those arrests long before the orders reached Malatya. Her Turkish friends began to avoid her gaze in the market. The air in the village, usually so light with children's laughter, grew heavy and silent. A month later, the first deportation orders arrived. They were phrased with deceptive calm, a temporary relocation for the war's duration. They were told it was for their own safety. They were told they would return. Vartouhi was to prepare packs for her children and her father. Krikor, weak from age, knew the truth. He looked at Vartouhi with eyes that seemed to have aged a century overnight. "Do not let them see your fear," he whispered. "We are a strong branch. We will not easily snap." The packing was a cruel choice. What do you take when you are leaving your whole life? They packed dried figs, a few cherished family photos, a small gold locket that had belonged to Vartouhi's mother. The items they left behind, the family Bibles, the fine wool rugs, the copper pots, felt like betrayals, pieces of their identity abandoned. On the morning of their departure, Malatya was a chaos of forced assembly. Gendarmes, soldiers in government uniform, moved with cold efficiency. The village square, once a place of celebration, was now a holding pen. When Vartouhi and her family stepped onto the road, they left more than their homes. The air behind them was thick with a smoke that smelled of burning paper and wool. They watched, unable to look away, as Saint Garabed Church began to burn. Their road was a single, agonizing path south toward the Syrian desert. It was called a relocation, but it quickly revealed its true purpose. The convoy stretched for miles, a river of pain. The first days were marked by thirst. The soldiers only allowed them to drink from contaminated mud puddles, mocking their suffering. The heat was a physical assault. The elderly, like Krikor, were the first to weaken. Krikor, who had always carried himself with dignity, now leaned heavily on Vartouhi's arm. His steps became shorter, his breath raspy. On the fifth night, as they huddled under the uncaring desert stars, he called Vartouhi to him. His voice was a threat. "Do not let memory fade," he said. "They can take our homes, our lives, but they cannot take our spirit. Promise me, Vartouhi, promise you will remember Malatya." Vartouhi kissed his forehead, a promise sealed in tears. In the morning, Krikor did not wake. There was no time for a burial. Vartouhi marked the spot with 3 small stones before the gendarmes forced them forward with bayonets. The desert journey became a test of pure survival. The children's faces, once full and bright, became hollow and gray. Vartouhi learned the terrible efficiency of starvation. She learned to ignore the screams that punctuated the night. Their road was not just passive suffering. Gendarmes and local bandits, acting with official permission, routinely descended upon the convoy. They took the little food they had left. They separated the strong men. Vartouhi was forced to watch as friends and neighbors were cut down. The road itself was a graveyard, marked by the bodies of those who had fallen. For Vartouhi, the worst horror was the separation of children. Gendarmes would pull boys and girls from their mothers' arms, claiming they were being sent to special orphanages where they would be raised as Turks. The logic was insidious. To wipe out the group not just by killing, but by erasing their culture and identity. Vartouhi held her own son and daughter tighter, a useless defiance. She saw the same look of raw desperation in the eyes of other mothers. all clinging to their children as if their love alone could build a wall against the soldiers. Their target was the desert camp of Deir, ez-Zor. This was the end of the line. Deir, ez-Zor was not a city, but a hellscape of disease and despair. There were no buildings, just tents that failed to keep out the blistering heat. Typhon and cholera tore through the weakened population. When Vartouhi reached the camp, she saw that the living were already indistinguishable from the dead. She saw bodies stacked like cordwood. She realized that Deir, ez-Zor was not a destination. It was a disposal site. This was where the temporary relocation truly ended. Vartouhi and her children survived the initial typhus epidemic, but her son, weakened by a month of starvation, faded quickly. One morning, he simply didn't open his eyes. A week later, a strange silence fell over the camp. The soldiers were gone. The guards had vanished. The survivors didn't understand. Was it over? Vartouhi grabbed her daughter and stumbled out of the camp, joining a small group heading for the nearby Euphrates River. They walked for 2 days until they were intercepted. They were not intercepted by Ottoman soldiers, but by Russian troops who had pushed into the Eastern Front. Vartouhi collapsed, sobbing, into the arms of a young soldier. For the first time in months, she was safe. She was one of the few who had reached the end of that terrible road. She had lost her father, her son, her home, her church. The survivors were a diaspora, scattered across the globe, carrying the silence of a million lost voices. Years later, Vartouhi sat with her grandchildren, not in Malatya, but in a small apartment in Beirut. She had fulfilled her promise. She kept the small gold locket hidden, a quiet ember from a world that had been systematically extinguished. "We must never let memory fade," she would tell them, "because if we forget, the desert takes everything."